Have you ever heard of a simple fisherman who managed to single-handedly destroy an entire Japanese train? Because if you haven't heard yet, what you're about to read will completely change the way you see war, courage, and what an ordinary man is capable of doing when he has nothing left to lose. The scene begins in silence, but it's not the silence of peace. It's the silence that follows an explosion so powerful that even sound seems to have died. Fragments of metal fall from the sky like sharp rain. The sea, choppy and rough, is covered in burnt oil, broken wood, and bodies that didn't have time to understand what happened. In the midst of it all, an American sailor crawls across a piece of wreckage, his face burned, one eye swollen, and his breath cut short. He's alive, but barely. Behind him, the ship where he served no longer exists. It was swallowed by the sea as if it had never been there. The sailor raises his head with difficulty, and that's when the real threat appears. On the horizon, enveloped in smoke and the red reflection of the explosions, they appear, the giants, an entire Japanese convoy, destroyers, escorts, transport ships, ammunition, tanks, troops, all advancing like a mobile wall designed to crush any resistance. It's the kind of formation that shouldn't be interrupted by anything. A perfect war machine planned to destroy, occupy, dominate. And that sailor knows no one can stop that. Not with what was left. Not with the despair etched on the faces of the survivors scattered in the water. The sky opens in a flash as a Japanese destroyer fires another round. The shockwave pushes the wreckage even further. The sailor screams, not from the impact, but because he finally understands. That was their death coming, at the slow and cruel pace of giant machines. And the worst part is that it wasn't just the death of men. It was the failure of an entire strategic position. A huge breach that would put islands, bases, routes, and perhaps thousands of lives at risk. The Japanese advance with absolute confidence. They believe that nothing can reach them now. They believe that everyone there is defeated, broken, without any chance of reaction. And anyone who sees that scene would agree. Because, looking at it that way, it really seems like it's over, but it's not over yet. Not like that. Not for them. And definitely not for the man who hasn't even appeared in this story yet, but who is going to turn everything upside down. Because in that same sea, in that same chaos, there is a man who doesn't wear a uniform, who doesn't know how to march, who has never received military training, someone the Japanese would never see as a threat. And yet, in just a few hours, he's going to do something so absurd that no naval doctrine, no commander, and no war manual could have predicted it. You are about to discover how, a completely insane move created by a poor fisherman, it was able to destroy the advance of an entire train. And, believe me, when you understand what he did, you'll need to reread it just to confirm that someone actually had the courage to do it. Have you ever stopped to think about what it really means for an ordinary fisherman to face an entire Japanese convoy alone? Before continuing with this absurd yet true story, take the opportunity to sign up, leave a like, and comment which one you're talking about, city and country you're watching. This helps me understand how far these stories go without interrupting your moment here. Now let's get back to the point where things start to get really unexpected. The fisherman didn't yet know that, on that very day, his name would cross the path of a Japanese convoy. While gunfire ripped across the horizon and the sea burned like liquid hell, he was at another point on the coast, much quieter, trying to salvage what remained of his own life. His boat was old, small, built for calm currents, not for wartime storms, and yet that was all he had. The deck creaked, the ropes were frayed, the nets tattered. It was the exact portrait of someone who survived more through sheer persistence than luck. That morning, he had gone out fishing, as he always did, trying to secure the bare minimum for the next day. But the sea was different. It wasn't the wind, nor the tide, nor the waves. It was a strange silence, the kind only someone who had lived there for decades could perceive. The air seemed heavy, as if it were about to announce something, and deep. Down he felt it stirring within him, an ancient, almost instinctive restlessness, as if the ocean were holding its breath. This fisherman, a simple, thin, sunburnt man, with hands marked by ropes and salt, was always guided more by his feelings than by what he saw. It was the way he found to survive after losing almost everything: family, home, stability. The war had taken more than possessions. It had also taken the pieces of hope he tried to stitch together day after day. Even so, he remained. There, persisting because stopping meant accepting definitive defeat, and he was not a man who accepted death easily. The smell of burning came before the sound. It was as if the wind carried an invisible warning. He raised his face, frowning. "There's a war up there," he murmured to himself, as if he were talking to the sea. And when he heard the first distant explosion, that deep vibration that makes your chest tremble, he understood that something big was happening. But it wasn't fear he felt. It was something else, deeper, more brutal, a feeling that this would connect to his life in a way he didn't yet understand, but that was already changing the air around him. The sea began to bring in debris, small at first, then increasingly numerous. Pieces of wood, torn nets, broken floats, ammunition boxes, boots, and blood. Lots of blood. He slowly brought the boat ashore, gathering in a few survivors, helping as best he could. They were few, confused, many delirious. The fisherman didn't speak English, but he understood pain, fear, and despair in any language. And when one of the dying sailors managed to whisper, "Japanese convoy," he knew the threat wasn't just near, it was coming straight toward them. The fisherman looked around. The waters were heavy, dark, laden with smoke and the slow hum of approaching war machines, but his expression wasn't one of panic. It was one of calculation, of someone who had spent his entire life reading the behavior of the sea like others. Read maps. He felt the vibration in the water, a regular, deep, mechanical pulse. Large ships, many, heavy, advancing in formation. And then something inside him ignited. It wasn't heroic courage, nor military sense. It was a strange combination of intuition and rebellion. He had no weapons, he had no training, he had no support, but he had the sea, and the sea that day seemed to whisper something like a warning or an opportunity. As the survivors pointed to the horizon, trying to warn him of the enemy's size, the fisherman stood motionless for a few seconds. His eyes followed the current, observed the movement of the waves, the direction of the tide, the wind speed, the position of the wreckage. It was as if he were seeing an invisible map that none of the wounded men would be able to interpret. He gripped the helm tightly. His heart pounded, but it wasn't fear. It was that feeling that precedes the big decisions that change destinies. He knew that if he stayed there, he would die, along with everyone else. If he fled, he would only live long enough to see the war devour everything around him. But if he did something, even if it seemed insane, maybe, just maybe, he could turn the tide in a way as improbable as his own life. The fisherman took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment and let the sea speak. And it was there, in the midst of that silent chaos, that a reckless thought took shape. Something that no one in their right mind would attempt. Something that no military manual would ever consider. Something that only someone who has spent their entire life understanding the behavior of currents could imagine. When he opened his eyes, there was a decision in them. A heavy, dangerous, but firm decision. He didn't know how he was going to do it. I didn't know if I would live long enough to try, but he knew with absolute clarity what I needed to do. The insane gamble would begin there, with a lone fisherman, an old boat, and the irrational audacity that only arises in those who have already lost almost everything. The fisherman wasn't born a hero. He was born a survivor. His name rarely appeared on any document, and when it did, it was always accompanied by simple words: hard-working, rustic, solitary. Life gave him no education, no opportunities, not even choices. He grew up in a small coastal village where the sea was as unpredictable as the poverty, and everyone learned early on that the only way to live was to accept what the ocean allowed. From childhood, he saw men disappear in storms, saw boats sink, saw entire families break under the weight of hunger and salt. This shaped his character, like the wind-shaped stones. Slowly, but deeply, his father, a quiet and stern man, would wake him before dawn. The dim light of the oil lamp illuminated their tired faces as they walked along the wet sand towards the boat. He barely had the strength to carry the nets, but he learned, by force, to anticipate the tide, to recognize the smell of the water when the weather turned, to identify the direction of the currents just by observing the movement of the floating seaweed. That boy grew up absorbing everything, because in their lives, understanding the sea was a matter of life or death. When he was only 14 years old, He lost his father to a treacherous wave that capsized the boat in the midst of a sudden storm. He watched the man be swallowed up without having a chance to scream. That night, something broke and formed at the same time. A persistent fear of the ocean and an absolute respect for it. A duality that only those who live by it can bear without going insane. From then on, he was alone, without family, without money, with nothing but the skill that the sea, cruel as it was, had taught him. By force, he worked on other boats, hauled nets for older men, faced storms that ripped chunks of wood from the deck, and nights when the breeze seemed to whisper bad omens. But despite everything, he had something no other fisherman had, an almost intuitive perception of the water's behavior. It was as if the sea spoke to him, and he learned to listen. He learned to identify currents that changed without warning. He learned to sense distant vibrations before they became dangerous waves. He learned to recognize when something large was moving beneath the surface, even in the dark. He learned to predict tides as if he had invisible maps engraved in his mind. And in times of war, this skill ceased to be merely useful. It became an unappreciated gift. The arrival of war brought even more suffering. Fishing became scarcer. Military ships controlled stretches of the coast. Distant explosions shook the windows of poor houses, and sometimes the sea returned unknown corpses. The fisherman would collect some, silently place them on the sand, and light an improvised candle. It was his way of remembering that, even in the midst of this chaos, lives still mattered. But the truth is that behind that humble gesture, there was a lot of accumulated pain. He wasn't a strong man by choice. He was strong because he had no other option. The losses, the storms, the hunger, the failures, all of that shaped a human being who knew how to deal with the impossible because the impossible had always been part of his routine. And this life, so harsh and so invisible, was about to connect with one of the most improbable moments of the war. That day when he heard from the survivors that a gigantic Japanese train was coming, his reaction wasn't one of astonishment. It was one of analysis. He observed the direction of the tide, felt the movement of the waves breaking in irregular rhythms, and realized that the water was carrying debris in an oblique line that only someone like him would notice. That was important, very important. The military would never have realized that that seemingly weak current could become a destructive force. They lacked that perspective. They lacked that sensitivity. They lacked years of survival experience at the seashore, teaching them day after day that currents are invisible roads. The fisherman realized something that no captain would ever realize. That specific current, at that exact time, with that wind and that tide, could carry anything, including mines, bombs, gasoline, explosive debris, directly into the convoy formation. And this is where the improbable begins to take shape, because only someone who grew up being shaped by the water, who lost their father to the sea, who lived for decades in fragile boats, is able to look at that current and see a chance, not a chance for glory, nor for an epic victory, but it was a chance to prevent more innocent people from dying, a chance to fight without weapons, a chance to transform all that she has suffered into strength. He felt his heart race, not from fear, but from purpose. For the first time in her life, the accumulated pain seemed to point to a single moment. That one. The insane move he would make later wasn't born of heroism. It was born out of necessity, out of revolt, for survival, from the scars that life has etched on her body, and from an absolute understanding of the sea, an understanding that no one else possessed. And it is now, with all of this inside him, that the fisherman begins to mentally visualize the impossible plan that would change the fate of an entire convoy. Up until that moment, the fisherman still didn't know. As he was about to confront the Japanese convoy, he only knew he couldn't stand still. The sea was restless, laden with smoke, debris, and an eerie silence between distant explosions. The wounded survivors trembled at the bottom of the boat. Some begged to escape, others simply stared into the void, numb with pain. But not him. He observed. He thought. He connected dots that no one else saw. As he slowly moved his boat away from the Japanese's direct route, something caught his attention. A piece of wood floating erratically, spinning in short circles but being pulled in a fixed direction by the current. He placed his hand in the water, a gesture he had made since childhood, and felt the invisible force pulling diagonally. That movement, imperceptible to any ordinary person, was a clear map to him. There it was, the track. There it was, the way. There, amidst the destruction, lay the only glimmer of hope. The war was fought with ships, torpedoes, bombs, tanks, and airplanes. He had none of that, but he had chains. He had old boys on the boat. He had cables, nets, and leftover gasoline that he always used as a reserve. And he had a skill that the military world underestimated, the ability to predict exactly where the water would carry any floating object. It was in that instant that the thought was born. Small, improbable, almost absurd. What if he used the tide as a weapon? What if he turned debris into explosives? What if you managed everything as if you were herding a school of fish? The idea seemed so irrational that even he hesitated. He knew that any mistake would mean his death, not just physical death, but a slow, agonizing death, with the boat exploding before he could save anyone. But there was something greater than fear there, the feeling that the sea was giving him a unique chance. He began to work. His movements were quick and precise, not because he was confident, but because he was desperate. He pulled ropes, tied pieces of wood, collected empty fuel cans, and filled them with what remained of the gasoline. Mixed with oil that floated on the surface, he knew that this could set everything around him ablaze, but he also knew that, if the current did its job right, the Japanese wouldn't have time to react. The fisherman approached a large, broken buoy floating near the wreckage of the sunken American ship. It still had pieces of metal attached. He tied it tightly, using complex knots he had learned from his father. Then he tied on old nets, pieces of wood, and loose metal objects. It looked like a meaningless jumble, until he began pushing it all with the boat, guiding that makeshift block to the exact spot where the current would catch it. It was like putting together an invisible jigsaw puzzle in the middle of the ocean, a strange calculation involving wind speed, sun position, wave depth, and tidal slope. Any soldier would think that was madness. Any commander would laugh at the idea. But for him, it made sense. And then came the final detail, the most dangerous, the most insane thing. He decided to tie it up, unstable explosives, remnants of grenades, ammunition, projectiles, and even a punctured fuel tank, inside that tangled mess of netting. He pulled everything with steady hands, ignoring the risk of detonating it all right there. Each piece he added increased the chance of death, but also increased the destructive potential. He worked like a man who had nothing left to lose, and in a way that was true. When it was finished, the contraption looked like a strange, floating creature. Buoys, wood, metal, gasoline, ammunition, all held together by cables. But for those who knew the sea, it was much more than that. Era, a mobile trap, a bomb driven by nature itself. The fisherman took a deep breath. Now came the hardest part, positioning everything without being seen. He knew the train was moving fast. He knew destroyers could sweep the area with searchlights. He knew Zero-type aircraft could appear at any moment, but he also knew there was a blind spot that few noticed, an area where the current silently diverted objects from the main path and pushed them to the flank of the formation. He drove his improvised bomb there, millimeter by millimeter, stroke by stroke, sweat dripping down his face, the heart beating in the same rhythm as the tide. When he finally put the set down, something inside him shuddered. The water pulled the pump exactly as he had imagined. She began to move, slowly, but steadily. Perfect direction. Silent. Ruthless. It was as if the plan were alive. The fisherman watched, holding his breath as the current did its work. And then, as the sun hid behind the distant smoke, he realized the impossible was becoming real. The bomb was heading straight for the side of the first Japanese ship. A massive destroyer. Armored. Pure steel moving tons of war. He felt his legs trembling. Not out of fear, but out of disbelief. It was like watching a wooden boat attempting to knock down an iron wall. And there, in that fraction of a second when fate seemed to hold its breath, the fisherman finally murmured the words that would unleash the psychological terror that would change everything. Now, it's going to happen. The improvised bomb glided down the current with the silent precision of a predator. The fisherman kept his eyes fixed on it, while his old boat rocked to the rhythm of the sea. He knew that from then on, he had no more control. The sea would or would not do the rest. It was like casting the perfect bait and hoping the fish would bite. But this time the fish was a Japanese destroyer weighing thousands of tons. Time seemed to stretch. Each second turned into a minute. Each wave seemed to threaten to push everything in the wrong direction. The fisherman bit his own tongue without realizing it, trying to control the anxiety that rose like fire in his chest. That was it. It was now. Or it had all been senseless madness. And then it happened. The first explosion wasn't pretty, nor cinematic. It was a dry, muffled, almost discreet bang, but enough to make the fisherman's eyes widen. The water rose in a short jet, as if something were breathing before waking up to panic. For a moment, nothing seemed to change, but on the deck of the Japanese destroyer, soldiers rushed to the sides, shouted commands, looked out to sea trying to locate the threat that didn't exist. There was no submarine, there was no periscope, there was no visible torpedo. There was only silence. The fisherman felt a strange surge of adrenaline. The trick had worked, not completely, but enough to ignite the first spark of fear in the Japanese formation. He knew that military panic never begins with an explosion. It begins with mystery, with the inexplicable, with the fact that nobody knew where it had come from. But the sea had not yet finished its work. The current, obedient as a trained animal, pulled the explosive tangle further into the formation. And before any Japanese commander had time to reorganize the defense, the second explosion came. This one was truly violent. The water rose in a tall column illuminated by a flash that cut through the morning mist like lightning. The fisherman closed his eyes for a second. It wasn't joy. It wasn't pride. It was shock. It was disbelief. It was the feeling that he had touched something too colossal, bigger than any fisherman should have in his hands. On board the Japanese ships, chaos was beginning to take shape. Alarms sounded. Commanders shouted. Flares flashed frantically. Some soldiers pointed toward the sea as if expecting to see an American submarine surfacing at any moment. Others fired into the water, trying to hit what they couldn't identify. The fisherman watched from afar, his expression a mixture of tension and sadness. He never wanted to kill anyone, but he knew that in that scenario, the alternative would be infinitely worse. The invasion would continue, more people would die, and that coast would be forever marked by the enemy's advance. But then came the moment that would transform the fisherman into an unseen legend. The third explosion was so powerful that the impact vibrated all the way to his boat, even from a distance. The Japanese ship that was hit suffered a jolt that caused it to turn several degrees to the side. The crew panicked. Now it was clear. Something was attacking them. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't floating debris. It was direct aggression, and there was no logical explanation for it. One ship signaled to the other. Another responded with flashing lights. Commanders pointed in different directions, unable to decide where the attack was coming from. The fisherman knew that this was the time to intensify the psychological terror. He pulled up 2 more buoys tied on scraps of metal, filled small cans with gasoline, and threw everything in a calculated manner into a spot in the sea where the current would amplify the chaos. They weren't real bombs. They were sounds, impacts, distractions. But in the midst of fear, any noise becomes a threat, and it worked. On the Japanese deck, the soldiers began firing at shadows, at the foam of the waves, even at their own reflection in the water. Fear creates disorganization. Fear causes wasted ammunition. Fear leads to miscalculations. Fear destroys discipline, and the fisherman was using fear as a weapon. The Japanese convoy began to change formation, trying to protect themselves from an enemy they couldn't see. And, as they changed position, they brought the ships even closer together, creating a perfect scenario for accidents, collisions, and misinterpretations. One destroyer passed so close to another that it nearly tore off part of its bow. Flares exploded in the sky, as if announcing a grotesque spectacle. No officer could understand how such a precise attack left no trace. They imagined American submarines hidden in impossible positions. But the truth was much worse for them. There were no submarines. There was no fleet. There was no technology. There was only one man, a fisherman, a ghost at sea. And then, when the panic reached its peak, came the explosion that would change everything. The greatest of them all, the tallest, the brightest one, the deadliest. The impact struck a supply ship laden with ammunition. The explosion lit up the sky for seconds that felt like hours. Flames shot so high they seemed to touch the clouds. Soldiers were thrown onto the deck. Alarms blared like metallic screams, and that's when psychological terror did what it was supposed to do. The Japanese train retreats, not because they were defeated, not because they had lost firepower, but why? They were afraid of the unknown. And at that moment, the fisherman understood that he had just become something he never imagined he could be, the nightmare of an entire naval force. The explosion that lit up the sky turned the fisherman into a ghost for the Japanese, but it also turned him into a target. As soon as the cloud of fire rose high as a mountain of light, the Japanese commanders finally understood that they were not dealing with accidents. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't a random current. It was an attack, and there was nothing more humiliating for a military force than being attacked by something that couldn't be seen, heard, or understood. The sea, which until then had seemed a silent ally to the fisherman, changed its mood. It now carried the vibration of enemy engines, the waves from the destroyers, movement, and the electrical tension of those seconds. The fisherman perceived this. The water seemed heavier, faster, more furious. It was as if the ocean were warning him. They come, and they came. The first destroyer turned its bow violently, creating a huge wave that nearly capsized his boat. The Japanese vessel advanced like a hungry wolf, searching for any sign of the invisible enemy. Searchlights swept across the waters, blinding the fisherman for a moment. He had to throw himself to the bottom of the boat to avoid being seen. He lay there, trembling not from the danger, but from the sound of the propellers approaching like giant blades spinning on the brink of death. When he stood up, it was too late. A Japanese reconnaissance boat was coming straight towards him. The fisherman revved the old engine to its maximum. The boat responded with groans, vibrations, and puffs of smoke. The speedboat was coming so fast it was kicking up water, as if cutting the ocean in two. Gunshots began to echo, dry crackles that ripped through the air. He heard bullets hitting the hull, saw splinters of wood flying, and smelled gunpowder mingling with salt. He wasn't a soldier. He didn't know how to shoot. He had no training. But he knew how to navigate among rocks, reefs, and sandbanks, where no large ship would dare to enter. That was his only shield, and he used it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He turned the boat to the left, then to the right. It veered away from a rock. Formation by centimeters. The Japanese speedboat nearly collided with a submerged stone tower, but they were stubborn, and they came after him angrily. A projectile passed so close that it cut part of his hat. Another pierced the deck and ripped off a huge chunk of wood. He felt the boat grow heavier, water rushing in. He needed to escape, but he also needed to keep the boat afloat. It was an impossible struggle to run for his life while simultaneously preventing the boat from sinking. Then a distant but powerful explosion caused the sea to rise like a wall. A bomb dropped from one of the larger ships landed just a few meters away. The water surged so violently that it threw the fisherman out of the boat. He hit the surface as if pushed by a wall. The cold water tore at his muscles. For a second he thought he was going to sink, that this was the end of it all, but it wasn't the first time the sea had tried to kill him. He emerged with difficulty, coughing, desperately searching for his boat. He saw that it was on its side, almost capsized, but still floating. He swam forcefully, ignoring the blood running down his forehead, and clung to the hull. With what little strength he had left, he righted the boat. He climbed up, groaning, dazed, but alive. The Japanese speedboat was approaching again. This time there was no escape. The engine was failing. The boat was full of holes. Water poured in relentlessly. He looked at the horizon, at the Japanese convoy still in formation, now divided, suspicious, firing at the invisible. He could give up. He could stop there. He could let the sea take care of the rest. But then he remembered the survivors he had saved, remembered the destroyed American ship, remembered his father drowned years ago, and something ignited within him. He opened the toolbox and pulled out a can full of gasoline mixed with oil. The rest he had saved. With trembling hands, he poured some of the mixture into the sea, creating a dark stain that spread quickly. Then he tore a piece of cloth, dipped it in the gasoline, and lit it with the tip of a wet match that miraculously caught fire. He threw the burning cloth into the sea. The surface burst into flames with a snap. Tongues of fire spread out as if chasing something. The Japanese speedboat tried to swerve, but it was too late. It passed through the middle of the burning patch. Its engine caught fire. It lost control, and exploded in a small flash, but enough to delay the pursuit. The fisherman fell to his knees. He was exhausted, bleeding, half blinded by the smoke. He was breathing heavily, almost swallowing his own fear. And yet, I needed to keep going. The train was still there. The Japanese still saw ghosts in the water because he had put them there, and now ghosts were coming after him. Another destroyer turned in his direction. More shots fired, more explosions, more shadows cutting through the water. He needed to hide, and fast. Using all the strength he had left, he steered the boat toward an area of shallows where only local fishermen dared to navigate. Hidden rocks, treacherous sandbanks, winding paths. Large ships could not enter there. He also risked running aground forever, but any fate was better than turning to smoke on the deck of a destroyer. The boat scraped against the rocks. It creaked, it cracked, but it moved forward. The Japanese stopped at the edge of the shallow area. They were afraid of damaging the hull in pursuit, but they didn't. Retreat. They stayed there, watching, lanterns on, engines roaring, a metal circle waiting for him to make a mistake. The fisherman huddled in the bottom of the boat, breathing as little as possible, knowing that any wrong move would mean the end. And there, surrounded, wounded, exhausted, he understood something that few men understand while they are still alive. Greatness comes at a price, and he was paying every penny. The fisherman remained motionless inside the half-sunken boat, his body trembling with cold, pain, and exhaustion. The Japanese destroyers remained there, stationary at the edge of the shallows, illuminating the area with spotlights that cut through the darkness like knives of light. He felt that any movement could be his last. His heart beat slowly, heavily, as if giving up. He knew he didn't have the strength to create another trap, another improvised bomb, another absurd trick. But he also knew that as long as he was alive, he still had one last weapon: the sea. The sea is not static. It changes, it breathes, it turns. And that night the fisherman perceived, with his almost supernatural sensitivity, that the tide was turning. Slowly, but turning. The water rose, gained strength, pushed sediments, dragged sand, moved internal currents. The Japanese didn't notice. For them it was just rising water. But for the fisherman, it was a golden opportunity. He knew that the high tide would completely change the course of floating objects, throwing everything, trapped in the shallows, back into the open sea. And there, hidden among rocks and sand, were bits of hell, ammunition, projectiles, explosive pieces from the ship that had caught fire earlier. They were unstable fragments, but still dangerous, and they were all about to move. The fisherman slowly raised his head above the edge of the boat. He watched the searchlights. The destroyers remained motionless, pointing their weapons, waiting for the invisible attack that would never come in the same way again. The irony was cruel. They feared an enemy that had already made its final move hours before, when it launched its first improvised bombs. With effort, the fisherman tore a piece of wood from the bottom of the boat and began to gently beat it against the side, creating small discrete waves, but enough to loosen the explosive bits that were stuck between the rocks. He knew that area like the back of his hand. He knew which rocks formed submerged channels where objects could be guided by the tide like a school of fish. And then he saw a faint metallic glint reflecting the moonlight, a loose artillery shell. Right behind her, larger pieces, fuel cans, mixed ammunition, everything floating back into the sea. Everything is going exactly as he predicted. The fisherman closed his eyes for a moment. It wasn't joy. It wasn't triumph. It was just a silent acknowledgement. The sea had agreed to help him one last time. When he opened his eyes, his fate was already sealed. The tide picked up the explosive fragments and began pushing them out of the shallows. It was slow, almost poetic, as if the ocean were sweeping its own surface, returning what men had used to kill. The Japanese, on the other hand, remained blind. They didn't imagine that what was coming towards their formation wasn't an intentional attack, but a consequence of the very bombs they had dropped hours before. The fisherman watched in silence. The first collision occurred with a muffled, almost timid sound. Then came the second one, and on the third attempt everything exploded. It was such a huge explosion that it illuminated the destroyer masts as if it were daylight. Flames rose, smoke billowed, and enormous waves formed. Soldiers ran from one side to the other. Commanders shouted. Searchlights went out. Sirens blared incessantly. And then, As if it were a final blow from fate itself, the tide pushed more explosive fragments directly against the hull of the Japanese command ship. The impact was devastating. The ship shook as if it had been hit by a real torpedo. Entire parts of the structure broke off. The crew panicked completely. The ship began to slowly list onto its side, spewing smoke and sparks into the air. A terrifying spectacle. And, at a distance almost invisible, was the fisherman, wounded, exhausted, but observing everything with the bitter serenity of someone who knows that war is made of deaths, but also of impossible decisions. That was enough to break the Japanese spirit. The group broke up. The remaining ships retreated. The mission was cancelled. The entire train, a gigantic, powerful, and feared force, turned back, defeated by something they couldn't even name. And the fisherman? He didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He didn't shout victory. He simply let his body fall onto the soaked wooden platform of the boat. Pain gripped every muscle. Blood streamed down his face. The sea, now calmer, rocked the vessel as if cradling a child too tired to stay awake. He heard the Japanese engines receding, their roar fading until it became silence. And in that silence he wept, not out of fear, but because of the weight. He never asked to be a hero. He never wanted to carry deaths on his shoulders. He never imagined that the ocean that took his father would also be the same one that would place him before one of the biggest decisions of his life. When the sun finally rose, the Japanese ships were now just distant shadows on the horizon. The fisherman gathered his last strength, pushed the boat out of the shallows and rowed back to shore. Each stroke was a stab in his tired body, but he continued. The village appeared as a blur, then as an outline, then as a home. He arrived, weak but alive. The villagers found him lying unconscious on the sand. They took him home and cared for him. No one ever knew exactly what happened. No one imagined that this silent fisherman had been responsible for stopping an entire Japanese army convoy. He never told. He didn't brag. He didn't ask for recognition. He went back to his routine. I used to wake up early. He was repairing the boat. He cast his nets into the sea. And he lived his simple life, carrying within him a gigantic story. Bigger than oceans, bigger than battles, bigger than any military recognition. His legacy remained hidden for years, recorded only in confused notes from American officials, in reports about mysterious explosions, and in testimonies from survivors who swore they had seen something impossible happen before their very eyes. But him? He remained as he always had been, a simple, humble man shaped by the sea, a fisherman who did the impossible, and then he went back to his life as if nothing had happened. And perhaps that's what makes his story so epic, not what he destroyed, but what was he able to carry in silence? What do you take away from this story today? What lesson did you learn after witnessing every risk, every pain, and every impossible decision of this fisherman who turned the tables on an entire convoy? Tell me in the comments. I really want to know which part moved you the most and what this journey made you reflect on. And look, if this content touched you, surprised you, or made you see courage in a different way, leave a comment. Like and sign up, subscribe to the channel. This way you help more people receive stories like this, and you also ensure that the next videos, which will be even more intense, reach you without missing anything. Now comment below with one word that summarizes how you felt reading this story. I'm waiting for you so we can continue together next time.